Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to our deep dive. Today, it's Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. We're going to be, exploring this work, a very complex and controversial work. We'll look at the key themes and why they're still important today.
Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat.
Right.
And he was writing in the early 16th century, so that's the tumultuous era of Renaissance Italy. And he was really trying to figure out how to get and hold on to power in an age of instability and all these shifting alliances.
Yeah.
And The Prince is how he tries to deal with this problem. It's a pragmatic analysis, often a bit unsettling, of leadership and political strategy.
And to really understand The Prince, we have to consider Machiavelli's life and what motivated him to write this.
Yeah, his career was very tied to the Florentine Republic.
Yeah.
He was a high-ranking official. He was in charge of diplomatic missions, even military affairs. But then, in 1512, the Medici family came back to power in Florence.
Oh, wow.
And Machiavelli, they suspected him of plotting against them. So he was dismissed, imprisoned, even tortured.
So this period of exile, that must have really had a big effect on his thinking.
It did. It was during this time, living on his estate in relative isolation, that Machiavelli wrote The Prince.
Gotcha.
And some scholars think that he meant it to be a guide for rulers,
Okay.
maybe hoping to show off his political skills and get back in good with the Medici.
Yeah.
Others see it more cynically. They think The Prince is actually a critique of tyrannical rule, but cleverly disguised as a manual for wannabe autocrats.
So this debate about what Machiavelli really intended, and that just adds another layer to this already complicated book.
It does, and it also highlights why people are still fascinated by Machiavelli and why we keep trying to figure out the layers of meaning in his writing.
Absolutely. One of the most striking things in The Prince is how Machiavelli moves away from traditional ideas about virtue. How is his concept of virtue different from the classical virtues of justice, wisdom, and courage?
Well, for Machiavelli, virtue isn't about sticking to a set of moral rules.
Okay.
It's more of a practical and flexible approach to leadership.
Interesting.
It's being able to adapt, to changing situations, to act decisively, and to use whatever means are necessary to reach your goals, even if those actions might be seen as morally questionable.
That suggests separating morality from political action.
Yeah.
And that's caused a lot of controversy.
Exactly. Machiavelli challenges the traditional idea that you have to be ethical to be an effective leader. He argues that in politics, where survival is often at stake and you're facing clever adversaries, a ruler has to put being practical ahead of sticking to moral rules.
So you could contrast Machiavelli's ideal ruler with, say, Plato's philosopher king, to illustrate this point.
That's a really good point. Plato pictures a ruler who's guided by wisdom and justice, trying to create a just and harmonious society.
Yeah.
Machiavelli, on the other hand, presents someone far more pragmatic. A leader who understands the world is messy and often dangerous. And that means you have to make tough choices, sometimes even ruthless ones.
But Machiavelli isn't saying you should just disregard morality.
Right. Yeah.
He's saying you need to understand human nature and adapt your actions to the specific situation.
Absolutely. Machiavelli was a keen observer of human behavior.
Yeah.
He believed that people are basically self-interested, driven by wanting power and security.
Yeah.
So a successful ruler has to take these things into account, use them to their advantage, but also watch out for threats.
Which leads to another key idea in The Prince, the role of fortune, or as Machiavelli calls it, fortuna.
Machiavelli sees fortune as powerful and unpredictable. Like a raging river, it can wipe out even the most carefully made plans. He has this vivid metaphor where he compares fortune to a woman, someone who must be dominated or mastered through bold and assertive action.
That means even though a leader can't totally control what happens, they can lessen the impact of fortune, right?
Yeah.
Through planning and decisive action.
Exactly. A skilled leader thinks ahead, prepares for the unexpected, and grabs opportunities when they come up.
Yeah.
Machiavelli argues that fortune favors the bold, those who take calculated risks and shape their own destiny.
So this focus on being practical, on adapting to a world that's always changing, brings us to Realpolitik.
Realpolitik is a political philosophy, and it says that practical concerns and national interest come before ethics or ideology. Machiavelli is seen as a founding figure in realpolitik, because he stressed the need to get things done, even if it means using methods that some might see as morally wrong.
And this is probably most clear in his famous quote, "The ends justify the means."
Absolutely. This statement really sums up Machiavelli's belief that in politics, success is all about achieving your goals. And the methods you use, well, they're less important than the results. Of course, this view has been debated and criticized a lot.
Especially by people who believe that ethics should always guide political actions, even when faced with difficult choices.
Definitely. Machiavelli's idea of separating politics from conventional morality is challenging. It forces us to really think about the complexity of leadership and the potential conflicts between being practical and being ethical. It's something we'll keep exploring as we go deeper into The Prince and its lasting impact. This idea that you can separate politics from conventional morality, that, as Machiavelli puts it, the ends justify the means, it really is at the heart of the debate around his work. Maybe we should look at some examples in The Prince of how a ruler might have to use, well, deceit or manipulation, maybe even force, to keep things stable and stay in power.
Right, because for people today, we usually think of good leaders as being ethical. So this idea can be a little jarring, but I guess we have to remember the world Machiavelli was writing in Renaissance Italy, I mean.
Imagine you're a ruler, right? And there's this potential rebellion brewing in your city-state. You want to stop a full-blown, chaotic, bloody uprising.
Yeah.
So you might choose to crush it before it really starts, and that could involve using deception, maybe even force.
It's tricky, ethically.
It is, but for Machiavelli, keeping the state stable and secure, that outweighs those ethical concerns.
It makes me think of what Machiavelli says about appearing merciful and faithful and upright, but at the same time, being ready to act in the opposite way if you need to. He really emphasizes how important it is to look trustworthy and to inspire loyalty, even if, behind the scenes, the ruler's actions don't match up with those virtues.
Absolutely. Machiavelli understood how powerful perception is in politics.
Right.
He tells rulers to cultivate this image, one that lines up with what their subjects expect, even if what they're actually doing is different. Remember, he was writing in a time when appearances mattered a lot. Public image was everything. A ruler had to project this sense of strength and virtue that was just as important as what they could actually do.
Which leads to a really interesting question. Could The Prince actually be not a how-to guide for getting and keeping power, but more like a subtle satire, maybe even a warning about how power corrupts?
Scholars have been wrestling with that question for centuries. Some of them argue that Machiavelli, he had experience in a republic. He even wrote, praising republicanism in other works. So maybe The Prince is kind of a critique of tyrannical rule, just hidden under the surface.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe he wanted to highlight how dangerous unchecked power is, the moral compromises it forces you to make, by showing this very, stark, unsettling picture of what it means to be a leader.
I like that interpretation. It adds a whole other layer to what Machiavelli might have been trying to do.
It does. Reading The Prince as satire, it makes it a lot more nuanced. It suggests that Machiavelli wasn't just giving a blueprint to ruthless rulers, but maybe he was making a more complex commentary on power itself and the challenges of leadership in a world full of ambition, treachery, and constantly changing alliances.
Let's talk about something else in The Prince that's interesting. How Machiavelli uses language about gender, especially when he talks about fortune as a woman who has to be dominated or controlled. What does that tell us about the norms of Renaissance Italy and how it shaped the way people thought about leadership?
Well, the metaphors Machiavelli uses about gender, they definitely come from the time he lived in.
Right.
In Renaissance Italy, like in most of Europe, patriarchal norms were everywhere. Leadership and authority, these were seen as male things. They were linked with strength and assertiveness, control.
So when he says fortune is like a woman who needs to be mastered, he's reinforcing this idea that real leadership is masculine.
Exactly. He's drawing on this cultural understanding of masculinity as dominant, controlling. Femininity is often seen as unpredictable, something that needs to be, tamed or subdued. It's a framework that reflects the social hierarchies of his time. It shows how deep these gendered ideas about power were, even for someone as brilliant as Machiavelli.
It is amazing how those little choices of language can reveal so much about the assumptions of a culture, of a specific time and place. It makes you wonder if those gendered metaphors are still influencing how we see leadership, even today, maybe without us realizing it.
Absolutely. The language we use shapes how we understand the world. We need
Yeah.
to pay attention to those metaphors, those cultural assumptions, even the ones that have been passed down for centuries, because they might still be affecting our ideas about who should have power and what qualities we think make a good leader.
So let's move on to another famous and often misunderstood idea from Machiavelli. The relationship between fear and love as ways to govern. His statement that it is better for a prince to be feared than loved if he cannot be both, that's often taken out of context. We should really unpack what he meant by that.
It is often misinterpreted as, him saying it's good to be a tyrant, to be cruel, but Machiavelli's argument is it's more subtle than that. He's not saying that a ruler should aim to be hated or to terrify their people. He's pointing out how hard it is to stay in control in a world where loyalty can be so fickle and people often act out of self-interest, not out of some sense of love or duty.
So for Machiavelli, fear is it's more effective for control than love.
In a way, yes. He says fear is rooted in self-preservation. People will obey a ruler they fear because they understand what'll happen if they don't. Love, on the other hand, it's not as stable. It can easily change into hate or resentment if the ruler does something that disappoints people or betrays their trust.
But wouldn't ruling through fear just create this atmosphere of distrust and resentment? And wouldn't that lead to instability, maybe even rebellion?
That's a valid point. And Machiavelli, he does recognize that risk. He's not saying that cruelty or oppression are good. He's saying that fear should be used strategically as a way to prevent lawlessness and treachery. But you have to avoid becoming hated, because hatred, that leads to instability. It undermines the ruler's authority.
So it's not just about ruling by fear. It's more complex.
It is. Machiavelli is saying you need a calculated and strategic approach to governing. He understands that fear, when it's used carefully, along with other strategies, can be a tool to maintain order and security.
It clarifies things. He's not just promoting a reign of terror.
Right. He's advocating for this careful strategic approach, this understanding that fear, used the right way, can be one part of keeping order and security.
To really get Machiavelli, we have to look at when he was writing. Renaissance Italy, I mean, it was so fragmented politically, all these city-states competing with each other. How did that world shape Machiavelli's worldview?
Picture this. You have cities like Florence, Venice, Milan, all constantly jockeying for power, making and breaking alliances, fighting wars, and all this covert intrigue going on.
Oh, wow.
And then you have foreign powers too, France, Spain getting involved. So the political scene is already volatile, and they just make it more complex.
It must have been chaotic. Living in that world, it must have had a profound impact on Machiavelli.
Absolutely. He saw firsthand how fragile power is, how unreliable political alliances are. And you can see this reflected in The Prince. He stresses being adaptable, being decisive, and being willing to use, unorthodox methods to survive in this treacherous world.
Were there any historical figures or events that really stood out to Machiavelli, that really informed his analysis of leadership?
One figure who really captured Machiavelli's imagination was Cesare Borgia. He was the son of Pope Alexander VI.
Okay.
Borgia was ruthless, ambitious, a military leader who for a while managed to carve out this big chunk of territory for himself in central Italy. He used military force, political maneuvering, and he was just utterly ruthless and pragmatic.
Wow, would you say Borgia was like the embodiment of Machiavellian virtue?
In a lot of ways, yes. He was bold, cunning, and totally pragmatic. He wasn't afraid to use any means necessary to get what he wanted, whether it was diplomacy, military force, even treachery. Borgia's career, even though he ultimately failed, it gave Machiavelli a real-world example of the principles he wrote about in The Prince.
It's interesting, though, even though Borgia lost power in the end, Machiavelli still saw his rise and fall as valuable, as a way to understand how complex leadership is, how unpredictable fortune can be. It just shows that even the most skilled and ambitious leader can be brought down by things they didn't see coming or by bad strategic decisions.
Exactly. Borgia is both a model and a warning. He shows how effective Machiavellian principles can be for getting power. But he also shows how important it is to be adaptable, to think strategically, and to know that even the most cunning and decisive leader has limits.
So we've talked about the world Machiavelli was writing, and we've looked at some of his main ideas. Now let's talk about how The Prince was received when it came out and how its legacy has changed over time. It really is fascinating to think about how a book written over 500 years ago can still, cause such strong reactions and still be debated today. Let's talk about, how The Prince was first received when it came out and how its legacy has evolved over the centuries.
The first reactions to The Prince, they were mixed. Admiration and condemnation.
Ah, interesting.
Some saw it as brilliant, insightful, a great analysis of how power works. Others, they saw it as dangerous, immoral, a book that was basically arguing for tyranny and deception.
The Catholic Church was really critical of Machiavelli's work.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely. In 1559, The Prince was put on the Index of Prohibited Books. That's the church's list of publications they considered heretical or just dangerous. You see, Machiavelli separated politics from conventional morality, and he was willing to say that actions that went against church teachings, things like deceit, violence, putting the state's interests above religious doctrine, those were, they were okay, and that was a big problem for the church.
So that condemnation from the church, I mean, that really contributed to the negative view of Machiavelli that lasted for such a long time.
It did. The word Machiavellian, it became an insult. It was used to describe someone who was, cunning, manipulative, someone who would do anything to get what they wanted without caring about ethics.
It's interesting, though, how people have interpreted Machiavelli and his work, over time. Those interpretations have changed.
They have. During the Enlightenment, you had thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. No, they didn't necessarily agree with all of Machiavelli's ideas, but they engaged with his emphasis on realism. This idea that you have to understand the practical realities of power. They recognized that his insights had value, even if they didn't agree with all his conclusions or the methods he talked about.
So they acknowledged that he was right about how complicated political life is and how hard it is to balance ideals with the reality of governing, which can be pretty harsh.
Yes, exactly. And then in the 20th century, you had scholars who really tried to rehabilitate Machiavelli's image. They argued that he wasn't, the cynical advocate for tyranny, but rather he was a keen observer of human nature, and he was a pragmatic analyst of power dynamics.
They saw him as a product of his time, writing in an era of political instability, violence.
Yeah.
He just tried to give a realistic assessment of how power actually works in a world like that.
Yeah, exactly. And these scholars argued that Machiavelli wasn't actually promoting being immoral. He was just trying to present a clear view of the challenges that rulers face and the hard choices they often have to make to keep things in order, to maintain security.
So this shift in how we interpret him, it reflects this broader understanding that Machiavelli's work is complex.
Yeah.
And we need to think about the historical context when we're reading it.
We do. The Prince, it's not a simple handbook for dictators. It's more nuanced than that. It makes you think. It's an analysis of power that still resonates with people centuries after it was written.
What about today? What's Machiavelli's legacy now? How do his ideas still affect us?
Machiavelli's influence is everywhere, even if we don't always realize it. His work, it helped to create the foundation for modern political science by encouraging people to study politics in a more empirical way, less idealistic. He shifted the focus from these abstract philosophical ideals to a more grounded analysis of how power is actually gained and kept in the real world.
He made us look at the not so pretty parts of political life. And admit that the pursuit of power, it's not always, morally clear-cut.
Exactly. His ideas about human nature, about how leadership works, about using power strategically. I mean, they're still being studied and debated today by academics, politicians, business leaders, anyone who wants to understand how power works in all these different areas of life.
And the word Machiavellian, even though it's often used as a negative term, it also now kind of includes this broader understanding of strategic thinking, this recognition that sometimes you have to make tough choices to achieve important goals.
It does. The Prince is still a vital book. It makes you think. It challenges us to really think about these timeless questions about the nature of power, the role of leadership, the balance between being pragmatic and being ethical.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Machiavelli's The Prince, we've explored his life, the turbulent world he was writing in, his key concepts, and the enduring legacy of his ideas. We've seen how The Prince has been, praised, condemned, interpreted, and reinterpreted. But it's still a touchstone or reference point for anyone who
Right.
wants to understand power and leadership. It's complex.
It is, and it's a work that keeps generating debate, keeps making us think. It reminds us that the pursuit of power, while it's necessary for any society to function, it's a risky business. We need to think carefully about the ethical implications and the potential consequences of how it's used.
We hope this deep dive has given you a deeper understanding of Machiavelli's ideas.
Yeah.
And maybe it's encouraged you to go and explore The Prince and his other writings for yourself, to form your own conclusions about this complicated and influential figure.
And maybe most importantly, we hope it's made you think about power and leadership in your own life and
Yeah.
in the world around you.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.